Right. I want to bring in one more voice. Holly Williams is also standing by. Holly, you have spent a lot of time in and around the area where ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other groups have been staking claim. This is a little bit of a different video in that it's not a beheading. It's what we're told is a man being burned alive. I can only imagine it's even more graphic. Is this the sort of thing that new recruits would find appealing, Holly?
Dave Martin.
Yeah, perhaps. I think this execution video and previous execution videos really have two purposes. On the one hand, they horrify the enemies of ISIS. On the other hand, they appeal to its supporters. And of course, it also sends a message to all the Muslim countries in this region that have sided with the US against ISIS that the extremists intend to make those countries and their citizens suffer. And in fact, in the video, the extremists actually use a 14th century religious text to justify the brutal murder of a fellow Muslim. And that text says that disfigurement is an acceptable form of execution.
Holly, you know, what always seems to get lost as we discuss these gruesome killings by ISIS is the fact that many of these killings have happened, as you just noted rightly, to fellow Muslims. And so back to Anne-Marie's point, how is this in any way able to attract people to their cause?
Well, they attract extremists. And let's remember that many of the people who are being recruited into ISIS don't come from the Middle East, don't come from the countries that we think of as being part of the Muslim world. Hundreds of them come from Europe and other Western countries. But they attract members of an extreme fringe of Islam. In fact, many Muslims say that they are not Muslims at all.
I want to ask David Martin, bringing it back to you, David. You were talking about Jordan, and I want to get a sense of just how important of an ally Jordan is in this fight against ISIS. We know the King of Jordan was here. He is cutting his visit short because of this. But how important is it to make sure that Jordan remains stable and remains part of this coalition?
Well, Jordan is a major U.S. partner in the Middle East, with or without this campaign against ISIS. And to lose a longtime partner in the Middle East like Jordan to this particular campaign, I think would be a major blow to the coalition and could start the gradual unraveling of this coalition. But I also agree with Juan that this could break the other way and could simply galvanize public opinion for doing whatever it takes to go after ISIS. I should add that even before this video, there was some grumbling, and I only want to call it grumbling, among the Arab members of the coalition about the search and rescue mission when the pilot was shot down back in December. In other words, asking the question, well, if that had been an American pilot, would they have had enough rescue helicopters standing by that they could have gone in and gotten him? I don't know if that's a fair criticism or not, but it is just a little undercurrent that you heard before this video was released.
Let me bring in Juan. Juan, it's been reported that Lieutenant Qassab's father is a very influential tribal leader in Jordan, has the ear of the king. What kind of influence will that play into this? In other words, will there be any kind of influence from these tribal leaders who the king needs, obviously, to stay in power, although that family has been in power for generations there? Will they be able to pressure him to do something?
Well, Vlad, you're right. Jordan operates obviously as a kingdom, has some elements of representative democracy, though not perfect. But it largely functions based on these alliances and tribal dynamics that allow the king to continue to govern based on that support. And so there are a lot of dynamics underway in Jordan, but certainly the ability to have the key tribes and the key tribesmen and the leaders of those groups allied with the king and allied with his policies becomes critical. Now, as we said before, this is now incredibly personal, not just to the pilot's family and to his tribe, but it's now become a visceral issue, no doubt, for the Jordanian people. And how this plays out in the inner corridors of power in Amman is really to be seen. But I would imagine that the initial reaction, and you've begun to hear this already from the Jordanian government, is that they are going to forcefully avenge the brutal death of their pilot, and they're going to not back down from their engagement against ISIS. That said, whether or not that holds and whether or not there is consensus among the tribes and among the populace in Jordan to continue a fight which many don't see as their own. One of the narratives here is that this is not a fight that Jordan should be taking on as aggressively as it has. If that narrative takes hold, that thematic begins to take hold at the upper echelons of power in Amman, then we may begin to see a splintering, as David described, and that would be a real problem, not just for Jordan, but also the U.S. and its coalition partners.
I want to throw this out to basically whoever wants to answer, because you all have different perspectives, David, Holly, and Juan. Jordan had said in the midst of these hostage negotiations that failed that if this pilot was killed, that they would then speed up the execution of the other prisoners that they have associated with al-Qaeda and ISIS. We don't know what the King of Jordan is going to say, but do you think that's a good strategic move? Do you think it was bluster? What's your take on that threat and the impact that it could have on ISIS? Whoever wants to talk. We'll go. Let's go to Holly.
Well, just remember what the Jordanian nation has actually been through over the last few days. I mean, last week, ISIS offered to release a Japanese hostage, Kenji Goto, in return for a failed female suicide bomber who's on death row in Jordan. And Jordan, which is, as we've heard, a key U.S. ally, very publicly negotiated with the terrorist group, the first country to do that publicly. The Jordanians said they would release that woman, but only if their pilot was also freed. Now, that raised hopes in Jordan that negotiation with ISIS might actually work. Instead, though, they've now seen their pilot, Muaz al-Qasesba, suffer this horrendous death. And we heard tonight from a spokesman from the Jordanian army who said that his blood will not go unpunished. That certainly suggests very strongly that the Jordanians intend to take some kind of revenge.
And David, break it down for our audience. The United States is a war-weary nation, been at war since practically 9/11. Explain to our viewers why the rise of ISIS and these gruesome, horrific beheadings and killings, as gruesome as they are, for a lot of Americans, they do remain very far removed from what is happening there on the ground. Explain to our audience why the rise of ISIS and the continued, if they are growing in numbers, although the president and others have said that they've diminished their numbers repeatedly with these aerial bombings, but why this has an impact on the United States here at home.
Because if ISIS is allowed to establish this so-called caliphate that they want to establish in Syria and Iraq, that will then become the new Afghanistan, a land of radical Muslim beliefs populated by terrorists whose ultimate enemy is the United States of America. And so if they are allowed to create this caliphate, that eventually becomes a threat to the homeland of the United States. That's what's in it for Americans.
So, Juan, where do we go from here? I've read all sorts of things talking about whether the bombing campaign, the airstrike campaign is working, that for every militant that's killed, there's, another young man or woman coming over the border to fight, more and more foreign fighters being recruited. Where do we go from here? Is this bombing campaign working, and what's next?
Well, I think we're faced with some fundamental questions from a strategic standpoint. There's no doubt. I think elements of the bombing campaign are working. We've obviously seen the ISIS fighters that were trying to take Kobani have to withdraw, in part because of the air power. You've seen the Kurdish North defended with these air assaults. And you've also seen ISIS resources like their control of oil infrastructure taken offline because of the air assault. So in some ways, that's working. The problem, though, is, as David said, you still have a group, the Islamic State, that controls a vast swath of territory, and in fact is increasing its control of territory in Syria. It continues to govern in places like Raqqa, Syria, its base, Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, Fallujah in western Iraq, and continues to pull in thousands of foreign fighters to its cause, and is adapting and fighting every day that we speak. So the question is what we're doing working? Can we contain this threat? And if not, then what more needs to be done? And this is where you've seen the debates in the U.S. around the question of additional troops to train, to march forward, and whether or not we do have the staying power in a coalition and the proxies on the ground to fight effectively against what is, in essence, the best funded and best established terrorist group in the Middle East.
You know, Holly, I'm curious. There have been reports that when ISIS captures prisoners, typically they will release the Shia prisoners. They will release the Sunni prisoners and execute the Shia prisoners. Have we seen any? What are we hearing? And maybe Juan, you can also jump in on this. Is Iran at all looking at this situation and planning some kind of next steps?
Well, Iran is already involved in the fight against ISIS. Iranian authorities have admitted that their Quds special forces are fighting against ISIS here on the ground in Iraq. And they're doing so in tandem with the Shiite Muslim militias that are really leading the fight against ISIS in central Iraq. And they're doing so because the Iraqi army is in disarray and has been in disarray since ISIS swept across Iraq last year. So Iran is already involved. And what's interesting about that is that it means that here in Iraq, the U.S. is on the same side as both some very dubious Shiite Muslim militias and Iran in the fight against ISIS.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we want to thank you, Holly Williams, our foreign correspondent, David Martin, our national security correspondent, and Juan Zarate, senior security analyst, for joining us and illuminating a little bit, giving us a little more background into this pretty dreadful situation. We'll be right back.